At exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, the main lights of the fifth floor flickered on, and a soft hum filled the empty offices of Coleman Technologies. The dawn air still hung with the chill of Seattle's misty rain, and while the rest of the city remained tucked in its early slumber, Benjamin Ayed had already finished most of his night shift. With gloved hands and practiced motions, he maneuvered his mop across the gleaming tile floors, methodical and silent. Each stroke was precise, each corner clean with a diligence no one ever acknowledged. For 3 years, Ben had worked as a night cleaner in this towering building of glass and ambition. No one really noticed him. He arrived when most people left, and he vanished before the day began. Some employees might have recognized his face, but few knew his name. He had no office, no badge access beyond janitorial areas, and no presence in the company's inner workings. And yet, 5 nights a week, he made sure the very spaces that birthed innovations and hosted million-dollar deals were spotless by morning. Ben was in his mid-40s, with thick black hair peppered with gray and eyes that spoke more than he ever did. His movements were slow but not tired. There was a grace to them, a rhythm born of repetition and thought. He seldom stopped for breaks, preferring to keep his hands busy and his mind elsewhere. When the world around him was quiet, he thought of home, not this cold city of opportunity, but his real home, now unreachable. He had come to America not by choice, but by survival. Years earlier, war had torn through his homeland, turning cities into ruins and futures into memories. He had escaped with little more than the clothes on his back and a few documents tucked in a weathered leather folder. Among them were university certificates, credentials that had once meant something. They did not matter here. Here, he was just a cleaner. Yet, even in silence, Ben noticed everything. He heard the buzz of fluorescent lights, the clicks of elevator doors, the rush of caffeine-fueled executives, the small gossip that trickled through corridors. He knew which offices belonged to who, which desks were always left in a mess, and which conference rooms were used for the most important meetings. He saw ideas scribbled on whiteboards in languages of code and capital. He saw ambition, arrogance, brilliance, and loneliness. Most mornings, he left without saying a word to anyone. Occasionally, a junior employee might nod in his direction, but usually not. They were too busy, too distracted, or too unaware of the man behind the mop, and Ben never blamed them. He didn't seek attention. He didn't complain. He had learned long ago that the world often failed to see the quiet ones. On this particular morning, the company was preparing for a big product launch. Flyers were pinned on the walls, and meetings had run late into the night. Ben had entered one of the larger conference rooms just after 4 o'clock in the morning to clean up. Empty coffee cups littered the table. Whiteboards were covered in equations and mind maps, and someone had left a half-eaten muffin under a chair. Ben worked swiftly, cleaning the chaos left behind by urgency. As he gathered stray papers into a bin, his eyes caught on one particular sheet left slightly apart from the rest. It was thicker than normal printer paper, aged at the edges, and covered in intricate symbols. Nothing like the business charts or diagrams he usually saw. He paused, his breath catching just slightly. The symbols were familiar, hauntingly so. But before he could examine it further, the automatic lights flicked again, signaling approaching motion. He returned the paper to the table and resumed his cleaning. Soon, the early birds of the company would begin trickling in, and he would retreat into invisibility again. When he stepped into the hallway, he walked past a large, tinted glass door, the executive conference room. Inside, the chairs were still empty, but he knew it would not be long before Richard Coleman himself arrived. The man was as much a legend as he was a mystery. A tech genius who had built an empire from his garage, Richard was known for his bold ideas and bigger ego. Ben had only seen him in passing. He was the type who filled every room he entered and likely never noticed who swept it after he left. Outside, the rain had turned to a light drizzle. Ben stood by the window for a moment, watching the city wake beneath the gray sky. He adjusted the strap of his cleaning cart and made his way to the final floor before clocking out. Another night done, another day beginning. He didn't know that today, everything would change. By 6:30 in the morning, the fifth floor of Coleman Technologies had begun to stir. Lights glowed behind frosted glass. The whir of coffee machines filled the air, and the rhythm of typing echoed through freshly cleaned desks. Benjamin had just finished tidying the executive wing and was collecting his cleaning supplies when an unfamiliar voice pierced the usual hum. A loud burst of laughter that rolled out from behind the thick, partially open door of the executive conference room. Ben paused. Laughter wasn't unusual in the building, but this was different, louder, more theatrical, as if the speaker was putting on a show. He glanced at the hallway clock. It was early for a meeting, but a few senior executives often started their days ahead of the others. He wheeled his cart slowly past the door, not with the intention of eavesdropping, but simply following his usual route. Then he heard it again. "I swear, if anyone here can translate this nonsense, I'll hand them my entire salary for quarter." More laughter erupted, this time mixed with incredulous chuckles and the occasional sarcastic murmur. Ben slowed to stop just outside the door. It wasn't closed all the way, and through the thin gap, he could see Richard Coleman himself standing at the head of the long glass table, holding up a single sheet of paper. On it, though only partially visible, were those same strange symbols Ben had noticed earlier that morning, the ones he had paused to examine, only to set aside when the lights warned of approaching staff. Richard stood in his usual confident posture, a tall man with silvering hair and the easy arrogance of someone who had spent years being the smartest man in every room. A few executives sat around the table, familiar faces to Ben, though he knew none of their names. Laptops were open, half-empty cups of espresso steamed nearby, and every face was turned toward Richard, whose grin stretched with amusement. "I found this while clearing out a storage box at home," Richard continued, shaking the page like a magician revealing a prop. "It was in a folder with some of my grandfather's old academic materials. Probably nothing, just gibberish. But it looks ancient, doesn't it? Something Indiana Jones would chase." One of the executives leaned forward, squinting. "It's not Arabic, is it?" No, Richard replied dismissively. "I ran it through a dozen online translators. Total dead end. Maybe it's a hoax or just stylized nonsense. I thought it'd be fun to see if anyone here could make sense of it." "I bet it's just art," another chimed in. "Or something religious, some old ritual text." "Or a prank," Richard said. "Either way, I'll give my salary to whoever cracks it, though I'm not too worried. Pretty sure none of you took Ancient Cryptography 101. More laughter followed. Richard placed a sheet on the table, leaning back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. Ben stood frozen. Every muscle in his body tensed, not from fear, but from recognition. He knew what he was looking at, not in vague terms or with tentative guesses. He knew the symbols were not random. They were Aramaic, not the later, more common dialects, but an older, classical variant. He had seen them in texts he had taught, manuscripts he had once translated by hand. Before the war, before America, before this job. The lines on that paper were not decorative. They were language, structured, meaningful, and ancient. Inside the room, someone dared to guess. Looks like some kind of Proto-Hebrew. Maybe it's just inverted Greek. "You're all making it up?" Richard smirked. "Come on, where are our multilingual AI engineers when we need them?" Ben glanced down at his gloves. They were still damp from the sanitizer he had used in the break room. His reflection looked back at him faintly from the glass wall. A cleaner, that's all they saw. And yet, in that moment, he was the only person in that entire building who knew the truth behind the symbols. His pulse quickened, not from panic, but from an unfamiliar rush of significance. He took a step forward, then stopped. This was not his place. He was not supposed to be involved in meetings. The very idea of interrupting a group of executives, especially someone like Richard, bordered on absurd. What would he even say? "Excuse me, I believe I can translate the script you're mocking." They would laugh again. Or worse, think he was delusional. But then, something inside him shifted. It wasn't pride. It wasn't even ego. It was memory. The hours spent lecturing students in Damascus, guiding them through syntax, historical context, regional variants. The dusty pages, the ink-smudged translations, the satisfaction deciphering meaning from forgotten. That man still lived inside him. He had just been silent for a long time. From inside, Richard clapped his hands together once. All right, fun's over. Let's get back to the roadmap for Q4. Ben raised a hand and gently knocked twice on the glass door. The room froze. Heads turned. For a second, no one moved. The image was almost surreal. A man in janitor's uniform, holding a mop, standing at the entrance of the most important room in the building. Richard's eyebrows lifted. Yes? Ben opened the door slowly, stepping in with a calm he didn't know he possessed. His voice, though soft, was steady. I believe I can translate that document. Silence fell like a stone. A few people blinked. One of the younger executives suppressed a laugh, but no sound came out. Richard leaned forward in his chair, clearly unsure whether this was a joke. You, he asked, more curious than cruel. You've seen this kind of text before? Ben nodded once. Yes, I have. Richard tilted his head. All right, be my guest. He slid the paper across the table toward the edge. Ben stepped closer, ignoring the sideways glances, the poorly concealed smirks. He didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to read. He picked up the paper carefully, his eyes scanning the symbols. He didn't need to decode them. He understood them instantly. They formed a short passage, an excerpt likely copied from a larger manuscript. He cleared his throat. It says, "A man's value is not in the noise he makes, but in the silence he keeps. When the world forgets him, he remembers who he is." The room went dead quiet. The laughter, the smirks, the playful mockery, all gone. Richard stared at him, lips slightly parted. One of the executives, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes, broke the silence. Wait, how do you know that? Ben looked up, meeting her gaze directly. Because I used to teach this language. In another life. The silence in the executive conference room lingered longer than anyone expected. It was not the kind of silence that followed a dramatic moment in a movie, but something far denser, thick with unasked questions, uncertainty, and a collective realization that something unexpected had just taken place. Benjamin stood still, the ancient words still hanging in the air, while the paper rested gently in his hands. Across the table, Richard Coleman blinked once, slowly, as if recalibrating his perception of the man standing before him. "You taught the language?" the woman on Richard's left asked, voice lowered and cautious now, as though realizing how far they'd underestimated the person they'd just watched translate a dead language without hesitation. Ben nodded again. "Yes, I taught linguistics at a university in Damascus. Aramaic was one of my areas of focus, among others." There was a beat of stillness. Then another voice, a younger man near the far end of the table, leaned forward with narrowed eyes. "Damascus? Syria?" "Yes," Ben replied, keeping his posture composed. "Before the war." Another silence. But this time it wasn't awkward. It was filled with the weight of understanding. None of them had known. How could they? To them, Ben had always been a man who emptied trash bins and wiped whiteboards clean. Not once had they paused to wonder what his story might be. Richard sat back slowly in his chair, arms crossed loosely, his earlier amusement gone, replaced with something else. Scrutiny, maybe even respect, though he didn't voice it yet. Instead, he asked, "You taught university-level linguistics, but you work here as—" Ben didn't bristle at the question. He had heard variations of it before. "As a cleaner, yes. I've been here for 3 years." A silence fell again, but this time it was a kind where eyes shift uncomfortably. It wasn't shame exactly, but a slow, creeping awareness among those seated at the table, that they had shared this space with someone whose story they never imagined, whose intellect they never guessed, whose presence they never truly saw. Richard finally spoke again, and his tone had changed. "That passage you translated, it sounded more like poetry than documentation. Are you sure it wasn't interpreted?" "It's a direct translation," Ben said, calmly. "Older Aramaic uses metaphor heavily. That's part of its philosophical structure. You can translate it literally, but the meaning would lose depth. So I offer what the passage conveys, not just what it says." The older executive to Richard's right leaned in slightly. "What university did you teach at?" University of Damascus. Ben answered. I was a full-time faculty member in the Department of Ancient Languages. I specialize in Aramaic and early Semitic dialects. I published papers, conducted research, mentored graduate students. That was my life. And then Ben met his gaze. And then everything changed. It was the most he was willing to say in a room full of people who had just realized how little they understood the world beyond their own. He didn't owe them his trauma, only his truth. One of the younger staff, perhaps trying to recover the lightness that had vanished from the room, said, So, wait, you're telling us that the janitor, sorry, I mean you, knew what none of us could figure out. That's kind of incredible. Ben offered a soft smile, but didn't reply. The point didn't need to be restated. Richard stood, walked to the end of the table, and picked up the document again, holding it with renewed interest. My grandfather was obsessed with ancient history. He'd scribble notes in books, clip strange articles from old journals. I never understood any of it. I thought it was just eccentricity. He looked back at Ben. But you actually lived in that world. I did, Ben said, his voice still even, and some part of me still does. The room shifted then, not physically, but perceptibly. The tension eased, but it was replaced by something more respectful. No one reached for their laptops. No one interrupted. Richard sat down again, elbows on the table, studying Ben with a thoughtful frown. You ever consider working in linguistics here? We have teams working on AI translation models, natural language processing, things like that. Ben didn't answer right away. He was used to offers that came too late or without understanding. I've applied to positions over the years, he said carefully, many times, but the degrees didn't translate, literally or figuratively. Richard exhaled through his nose, not laughing now. Typical system. We ask for diversity, but build filters that delete it before it reaches our inboxes. One of the executives opened her mouth to add something, but Richard raised a hand, signaling a pause. Then he turned his attention fully to Ben. I meant what I said earlier, joking or not. If someone could crack that, I'd give them my salary. His eyes narrowed. And you did. So tell me this, what would you do if that wasn't a joke? Ben looked at him, reading the tone beneath the question. This wasn't about the money. It was about value, recognition, dignity. I wouldn't take your salary, Ben said, not unkindly, but I would take the chance to be seen and to contribute, not out of pity, not as a favor, but as someone who still has something to offer. Richard nodded slowly. Fair enough. Another pause stretched out between them. Then he leaned forward and pushed a small business card across the table. Come see me after your shift, he said. Not in the lobby. In my office. Ben took the card without a word, slid it into his shirt pocket, and gave a polite nod. He turned and exited the room just as quietly as he had entered. The door clicked softly behind him. Inside, the executives sat in stunned silence. For the first time that morning, they were not thinking about metrics, product launches, or shareholder calls. They were thinking about the cleaner they had never truly seen, until now. And outside the glass wall, walking calmly down the hall, Ben returned to his cart, picked up his mop, and continued down the corridor. Not because he had to, but because for one last time, he would finish the job they always assumed was the only thing he could do. He would finish the shift. But his story, his real story, had just begun. The hallway felt different now. Ben walked with the same measured pace, pushing the same cart he had used for the past 3 years. The cleaning supplies rattled gently with each turn of the wheels, and the faint scent of disinfectant still clung to his gloves. But something in the air had shifted. People passed him. Some nodded. Others merely glanced his way. But for the first time, those glances lingered just a second longer than usual. They weren't just seeing a uniform. They were seeing someone. By the time he returned to the janitor's closet on the lower floor, the early sun had begun to filter through the narrow windows, casting golden stripes across the tile. Ben removed his gloves, washed his hands, and took a long breath. His shift was technically over. His body, conditioned by habit, expected him to head home, get some rest, and prepare for his second job later in the day. But his mind couldn't detach from the business card, now tucked safely in his breast pocket. Richard Coleman's office. It felt like another world, one he had passed by, cleaned around but never entered. The elevators that led to the top floor, where the executive offices overlooked the city skyline, had always been a border he never crossed. It wasn't explicitly forbidden. No one had ever told him not to go there. But in places like this, the lines are drawn without signs, just atmosphere, tone, and silence. You knew where you belonged, and where you didn't. He stood in front of the mirror in the staff bathroom, adjusting the collar of his shirt. His reflection was tired but composed. He had trimmed his beard the night before. His eyes, though rimmed with fatigue, held a sharpness he hadn't seen in himself for a long time. For a moment, he thought about leaving, about throwing the card away and going back to the life he knew. Safety, even in struggle, had a strange comfort. But then he remembered what it felt like to stand in that room, to speak words no one else could understand, to be heard. He left the bathroom, passed through a corridor that smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, and entered the elevator. The polished doors closed in front of him, and as they ascended, a quiet tension built in his chest. Each floor that passed felt like a deeper step into unknown territory. When the elevator dinged and the doors opened, the view alone nearly stole his breath. The executive floor was built like a luxury suite. Soft lighting, minimalist decor, large windows revealing the Seattle skyline. Everything was designed to impress. A receptionist looked up from her desk and paused as Ben stepped out. She blinked, registering his uniform. Then her expression softened into a mixture of curiosity and recognition. "You're Mr. Ayed, right?" she asked. "Yes," Ben replied calmly. "Mr. Coleman is expecting you. You can go right in." He nodded in thanks, walked past her desk, and reached the frosted glass doors at the end of the corridor. They parted automatically with a soft hiss. Inside, Richard sat behind a massive walnut desk, typing something into a sleek, silver laptop. He looked up, smiled slightly, and stood. "Ben, you came." "I wasn't sure if I should," Ben admitted, closing the door gently behind him. "Well, I'm glad you did. Have a seat." Ben sat on the leather chair across from the desk. It was softer than he expected. Everything in the room was understated, yet expensive. A few abstract paintings hung on the walls, and a large bookshelf stood behind Richard. Most of the titles related to business, leadership, and technology. But on the lower shelf, Ben spotted something unexpected. A row of books on ancient civilizations, languages, and cultural histories. Richard followed his gaze and smiled again, more genuinely this time. "My grandfather's collection. I kept a few of his favorites." Ben didn't reply, but he allowed himself a small nod of approval. Richard leaned forward, folding his hands. "Listen, I'll get to the point. What happened this morning? Your translation, your story, it shook a lot of people, in a good way. But it also got me thinking about what kind of talent we overlook around here." Ben raised an eyebrow slightly. "You're talking about me." "I'm talking about everyone like you," Richard replied. "But yes, you in particular. I meant what I said. You have a knowledge base most of my staff doesn't even come close to. And we're developing AI tools that are trying to understand and translate ancient and obscure languages. Most of our data is digital, but some of it's incomplete, fragmented. Machines don't do well with nuance. You, on the other hand." He trailed off and then reached into his drawer. He placed a thin folder on the desk and slid it toward Ben. "This is a proposal," Richard said. "A contract for a short-term consulting position with the AI division. Part-time for now, flexible hours. No corporate nonsense, just real work." Ben opened the folder slowly. Inside was a clean, 2-page contract with the company's letterhead, a job description, and a proposed salary that made him blink twice. It wasn't CEO money, not even close, but it was more than he made in a month of cleaning, and it came with benefits. "You don't have to say yes now," Richard added. "I know it's a lot, but I didn't want this to end as just a nice story we tell around the water cooler. You have value, more than we ever gave you credit for." Ben closed the folder. "It's unexpected." "Unexpected doesn't mean unearned," Richard said. "We both know that." Ben looked at him carefully. He saw no trace of mockery, no sense of condescension, just a man who had been forced, for once, to see beyond the surface. That, perhaps, was the rarest thing of all in a place like this. "I'll think about it," Ben said finally. "I have a family, another job. I can't make this decision lightly." "I wouldn't expect you to," Richard replied, "but I hope you do." Ben stood. The room felt smaller now, more grounded. He extended his hand, and Richard shook it firmly. As he left the office, walking past the receptionist once more, he felt a shift deep within him. Not dramatic, not earth-shattering, just a small, internal realignment, like something that had been tilted for a long time was finally beginning to straighten itself. He entered the elevator again, descending back toward the world he knew. The line had been crossed, and he wasn't going back. Ben left the building that morning, carrying more than the contract Richard had offered him. There was something else, less tangible but heavier, a shift in possibility, a change in how the world might look if he stepped toward it rather than simply moved within it. For years, his movements have been quiet, deliberate, almost rehearsed. Now, for the first time in a long while, he was off script. By the time he returned home, the sun was fully risen, and his children were already getting ready for school. His youngest daughter, Layla, ran to him with a sleepy smile and clung to his leg before darting off to find her shoes. His wife, Amal, greeted him at the kitchen table with tired eyes but a warm presence, the kind that made even small rooms feel safe. She poured him tea as he sat down, and for a few minutes they said nothing. The television in the background was playing the morning news in English, but neither of them paid attention. Amal studied his face and eventually asked, "Something happened?" Ben nodded. "Yes." She waited, patient. He pulled the contract from his coat pocket and placed it on the table. Amal read it slowly, flipping through each page with careful fingers. When she finished, she looked up, her face unreadable. "It's real?" she asked. "It's real." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "Are you going to accept it?" "I haven't decided." Ben admitted, "It feels sudden, and not just sudden. It feels fragile, like something that could disappear if I breathe the wrong way." "You've never been afraid to start over," she reminded him. "You weren't afraid when we left everything. You weren't afraid when you took the night shifts. Why would you be afraid now?" Ben looked down. "Because this is the first time in years someone has seen me as more than what I do. I don't know how to carry that yet." Amal reached for his hand. "Then learn." The next day, Ben returned to Coleman Technologies at his usual time, dressed in his uniform and carrying no expectation beyond routine. He had not yet signed the contract. His mind was still turning over the implications. What it would mean to leave the comfort of familiarity, what it would mean to step into a place where he would no longer be invisible. The hallways were different now. Subtle differences. People looked at him. Some greeted him. A few even asked his name. It was as if the moment in the conference room had passed through the company like a quiet storm, softening the edges of long-held assumptions. Ben didn't seek attention, but he noticed a change, and it made the air feel lighter. That morning, as he moved through corridors with his cleaning cart, a young engineer named Tomas flagged him down. "Hey," Tomas said, hesitating a little. "You're the guy from a meeting, right? The one who translated that weird ancient text." Ben offered a polite nod. "Yes, that was me." "That was insane," Tomas said. "Seriously. I mean, I didn't even know what language that was. None of us did. You made everyone shut up in, 3 seconds. You should have seen Richard's face." Ben chuckled lightly. "I was too focused on the paper to notice." Tomas smiled. "Well, it was something else. You kind of blew everyone's mind." Ben thanked him, then moved on, the conversation still echoing as he turned the corner. At the far end of the hallway, he saw another door slightly ajar. A different conference room, smaller, occupied now by a few mid-level employees engaged in a brainstorming session. The whiteboard was covered in notes, and someone had left a stack of documents on the table. He didn't intend to eavesdrop, but as he passed, he heard again that same dismissive laughter, though this time it wasn't directed at him. One of the employees held up a piece of paper and waved it dramatically. "Here we go again," the man said. "Another gem from the AI model. Look at this mess. No one can make sense of this." Ben paused. Something in the tone pulled at him. He turned slightly, just enough to glimpse the page from the hallway. The script was different this time. Not Aramaic, but Syriac, another Semitic language he had studied in depth. His heart beat a little faster. The woman beside the man laughed. "It's like the AI just threw up letters." Another chuckle. "Well, unless one of us magically reads this, it's useless. We'll just scrap it." Ben hesitated. This wasn't his meeting. It wasn't his place. But then he remembered the last time he had paused and nearly walked away. He took a step forward, knocked once on the open door, and said, "I can translate that." 3 faces turned toward him. One of them squinted, confused. The man holding the paper frowned slightly. "Sorry, what?" Ben stepped inside, not boldly but without hesitation. "The text you're looking at. It's not nonsense. It's a dialect of Syriac, an early Christian liturgical language. Likely a fragment from a psalm or hymn." The woman raised an eyebrow. "How do you know that?" "I taught it," Ben said simply. "Years ago." The man holding the paper offered it, skepticism still on his face. "You're serious?" Ben took the page and glanced over the script. He read the lines quickly, quietly, then looked up. "It's a prayer, a plea for protection, loosely translated. May the light not abandon the broken, and may the wind carry their names where memory fades." The woman blinked. "That's beautiful." Ben returned the paper. "It's part of a larger work. You may have more fragments like it in your database. If the AI flagged this, it's possible it stumbled upon a larger text." The man who had first mocked the page now looked at him differently. "You work in maintenance," Ben replied. "For now." They didn't laugh this time. No one did. As Ben turned to leave, the woman stopped him. "Would you be willing to help us identify others like this? I mean, if you have time?" Ben looked at her, not with surprise, but with the quiet understanding of someone who had waited years for such a question. "Yes," he said. "I'd be glad to." He walked out of the room as calmly as he had entered, but inside him, something stirred again. The offer from Richard, the conversations in the hallway, this new moment. It was no longer about a single opportunity. It was becoming something larger, a shift in how people perceive him. Yes, but also a reminder of who he still was, beneath the years of dust, silence, and survival. He hadn't just translated words. He had translated his life back into meaning, and it was only the beginning. By the time Ben finished his shift, word had started spreading faster than he could track. Not gossip, not the empty chatter of office politics, but something more curious. Quiet acknowledgments, passing mentions in the break rooms, lingering glances in hallways that felt different from the indifference of days past. He hadn't asked for any of it, yet it moved through the building like a silent current, reshaping perceptions in its wake. Still, when Richard's assistant contacted him later that afternoon with a meeting invitation, not in writing but in person, delivered with a polite and intentional tone, Ben hesitated. He hadn't signed the contract yet. He'd helped that team with the Syriac fragment without any formal arrangement. But something told him this wasn't just a follow-up. This was something else. The meeting was set for 7 o'clock in the morning, an odd time for executives, but perhaps strategic, early enough to avoid attention or late enough to ensure that only those who needed to be there would attend. Ben arrived 10 minutes early. He had worn a clean collared shirt, tucked into dark trousers. Not formal, not too far for what he usually wore under his uniform, but this time without the overalls. He entered through the main lobby, greeted the receptionist who now smiled with more than just routine politeness, and made his way to the elevator that took him to the top floor. The executive conference room had changed, gone with the casual postures and playful energy that had once filled it. This time, there was a tension in the air, quiet, almost clinical, for people sat around the table. Richard, of course, at the head. Beside him, a senior HR representative Ben recognized but had never spoken to. On the opposite side sat Priya Desai, the head of AI development, and Charles Dunley, one of the firm's original partners, and a man whose name appeared on almost every internal strategy document. Richard stood as Ben entered. "Morning. Please, come in." Ben stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that felt heavier than usual. He took the seat closest to the center, opposite Richard, and waited without speaking. "We've reviewed your recent interaction with the NLP development team," Priya said without preamble. "The Syriac translation. Tomas submitted the transcript." Ben nodded once, offering no elaboration unless asked. "It was accurate," she continued. "In fact, it was elegant. You didn't just translate it. You interpreted its intention, its structure. That's something our models struggle with. And frankly, it's something even our linguists couldn't identify." Richard glanced at her, then turned back to Ben. "Which brings us to why you're here." Charles leaned forward, folding his hands. His voice, though calm, carried a certain edge. "We're intrigued, Mr. Ayed. Your abilities are unique. But this also presents a complexity." Ben tilted his head slightly. "Complexity? You're not on our professional staff," Charles said. "You've been working here under a different classification. The sudden attention you're receiving is disrupting routines. People are asking questions. Departments want your help, but there's no protocol for it. So, right one," Richard said, not turning to him. Charles continued, undeterred. "This isn't personal. It's structural. If we're going to use your skill set formally, it has to be defined. Position, title, pay, it all matters. But before that happens, we need to assess something more fundamental." Ben waited. The air in the room cooled. "You've been here 3 years," Charles said. "Never once submitted a formal request to transfer or apply internally. No resume sent. No inquiries made. Why now?" Ben responded calmly. "Because no one asked before. That's not how systems work," Charles said, his tone sharpening. "The system doesn't ask. It receives. That's how it stays functional." Ben didn't flinch. "And perhaps that's why it misses people like me." The silence that followed was brittle. Priya, sensing the tension, shifted slightly. "Let's refocus. What we're proposing is a bridge, a transitional role, consultant status. Short-term to start. You'd work closely with my team, focus on ancient language data, assist with model validation, help us structure training sets." Ben considered her words. "Would this require me to leave my current position?" "Eventually," the HR representative said, "but not immediately. We understand the need for flexibility." Richard finally leaned in. "Ben, this isn't charity. I know you know that. We're not doing this to be kind. We're doing it because you have something rare. But transitions like this, crossing internal boundaries, they make people uncomfortable, especially when the jump is big." Ben met his gaze. "Do you want comfort or capability?" Richard smiled faintly. "That's the right question." Charles, however, didn't seem satisfied. "If we move forward, we need guarantees. That you're committed. That this isn't temporary interest. We also need to vet your credentials, your academic history, publications, anything we can verify." Ben reached into his satchel and placed a worn folder on the table. "These are original copies of my university certifications, translated and notarized. I've submitted them to other institutions before. They were acknowledged but not accepted." Priya opened the folder and examined the contents. As she did, the room shifted again, not in atmosphere but in posture. The weight of proof settled in. "These are legitimate," she said, almost surprised. "You were published in several respected journals." "I was," Ben said, "before the war." The words landed softly, but they changed the mood. Charles tapped the pen against the table, then finally closed his notebook. "We'll proceed with the consultant status. Effective immediately, but with periodic reviews. No promises beyond the current term." Ben stood. "That's all I ask." Richard also stood, extending his hand. "Welcome to the other side of the glass." Ben shook it. As he exited the room, he didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel victorious. He felt grounded, like something had finally realigned in a world that had tilted off balance long ago. Outside the conference room, A few employees passed by, nodding politely. One even offered a quiet morning, Dr. Ayed, having clearly heard whispers from someone else. The room behind him may have cooled, but ahead, somewhere between familiarity and transformation, new doors were opening, and this time, Ben intended to walk through them fully seen. The transition from cleaner to consultant did not happen with ceremony. There were no announcements, no congratulatory emails, no formal welcome party. Ben preferred it that way. He was not interested in attention, only in purpose. He split his time carefully, half dedicated to his remaining cleaning shifts, which he hadn't yet abandoned out of caution and responsibility, and half spent inside a quiet room tucked into the corner of the AI research wing, where he was now officially listed as a linguistic consultant. The new space was modest, just a desk, a monitor, and a stack of printed datasets waiting to be reviewed. But the difference was unmistakable. People knocked before entering. They asked for his opinion. They waited for him to speak before assuming what he knew. One particular morning, Priya Desai visited his office with a box in her arms. "These just came in from the archives team," she said, placing it on his desk. "Digitized scripts from various ancient texts. A lot of it is scrambled, OCR mistakes, corrupted characters. We want to know what's salvageable and what's nonsense." Ben opened the lid. Dozens of scanned manuscripts stared back at him, some in languages he had not seen since his university years. Hebrew, Coptic, early forms of Arabic, Proto-Sinaitic, even fragments of Phoenician. His fingers moved across the pages reverently, as if reuniting with lost colleagues. This is remarkable," he murmured. "We thought you might like the challenge," Priya said with a small smile. Ben turned one of the pages toward her and pointed at a passage. "This is not a manuscript. It's a palimpsest. Someone wrote over an older text. You can see the ghost letters beneath." She leaned in, squinting. "You can read that?" "I can try." She nodded. "We'll let you work. But if you uncover anything significant, let us know. Some of this might feed directly into the new AI models." As she left, Ben remained seated. The pages spread before him like a conversation waiting to be resumed. For a moment, the hum of servers and digital clocks faded, and he was transported. Not to a lab, not to a corporate office, but to a room lined with stone walls, shelves heavy with books, and sunlight pouring through narrow windows high above. He had not allowed himself to remember that place in years. But now, seated at this new threshold between his past and present, the memories came clearer than ever. Damascus, the Faculty of Letters, the Department of Semitic Languages, the office that smelled of old leather and ink. His students, some eager, others barely awake, sat in semicircles around a long wooden table, while he wrote on the chalkboard, explaining syntax, historical evolution, the way a word in one language could be a seed that grew into many meanings over time. They had asked questions that challenged him. They had called him Professor Ayed with respect, not ceremony. He had spent hours with them in cafes after class, discussing manuscripts, politics, literature. He remembered Samir, one of his brightest students, who had once stayed behind after class to discuss a controversial Aramaic translation of a text from the Dead Sea Scrolls. "But don't you think," Samir had said, "that the original writer meant something more metaphorical, like an exile of the soul, not just a physical banishment?" Ben had smiled then, the way he rarely smiled now. "If you're already asking that, Samir, you're becoming a true scholar." He remembered Amal bringing lunch to his office, sitting quietly in the corner with a book of her own. She had never tried to compete with his world. She simply understood it. When the days grew dangerous, when the murmurs of conflict became thunder, they had stopped dreaming of promotions and academic conferences. They had started planning escape routes. A knock on the office door brought him back to the present. He looked up to see a younger researcher named Elliot standing in the doorway. "Sorry to interrupt," Elliot said. "We're having trouble identifying a particular phrase in one of the older datasets. It's in a dialect we don't recognize. Could use a second set of eyes." Ben gestured for him to enter. "Let's see." Elliot handed over a printout with a single line of text highlighted. Ben studied it. The shapes were crude, possibly handwritten, maybe even copied incorrectly from an original source. But he traced the structure. "This is Nabatean," Ben said, "an early script that shares features with both Aramaic and Arabic. It was used by a trading civilization in Petra, modern-day Jordan." Elliot blinked. "Seriously?" Ben smiled faintly. "It translates to, 'He who buries his name will plant it anew in the silence of the earth.'" Elliot exhaled. "That's poetic." Nabatean inscriptions often were. Elliot grinned. "I'm starting to think we need a full course on ancient philosophy just to work here." Ben set the page down. "Not philosophy, just history." As Elliot left, Ben sat quietly for a moment. These fragments of ancient voices, buried in sand, carved into stone, whisper across centuries, were to understand again. And now, perhaps, to help others understand as well. Later that afternoon, as he was preparing to leave, he received an unexpected visitor, Tomas. The engineer who had first told Ben how impressive his translation had been, entered with folded paper in hand. "This just came through," Tomas said. "It's not from the archives." It was sent by an outside contact, an anthropologist in Turkey, who's been working with us on indigenous language recognition. He's stuck on this one. Ben unfolded the page. The script was older than anything he'd seen since arriving at Coleman. Angular. Primitive. Likely pre-Semitic. A proto-writing system. He leaned in, brow furrowed. "Where'd he find this?" "Scratched into stone pillars near Göbekli Tepe," Tomas replied. "It's not in any database. The AI flagged it as nonverbal symbolic logic." Ben studied the symbols longer. "This is not logic. It's prayer. The order, the repetition of glyphs. This is a ritual sequence. But its structure is unlike anything I've seen in modern language databases." "So can you read it?" "I can try. But this will take time." Tomas nodded. "We've got time." As he left, Ben sat alone again, staring at the proto-script as the office lights dimmed with the approaching evening. There was something deeply fulfilling in this moment. Not the mystery of the symbols, but the fact that someone had brought them to him not as a novelty, not as a joke, but as a colleague. This, he realized, was the beginning of reclamation, not of status, but of self. Each glyph, each fragment, each consultation was a small piece of the man he had been and was becoming again. His past was no longer a memory hidden in silence. It was speaking again. And this time, the world was listening. The buzz in the building had shifted from murmurs of curiosity to a subtle undercurrent of intrigue. Ben was no longer just the anomaly who had stunned executives in a meeting. He had become an active node in the internal communications of Coleman Technologies. His name started to appear in email threads related to linguistic data validation, obscure language references, and internal training discussions. Some people still called him the janitor who translated Aramaic, but more and more, they were just calling him by name. He didn't seek it. He didn't post on internal forums, didn't broadcast his background, didn't correct misconceptions unless asked. He simply did the work, and the work spoke louder than any story could. One afternoon, while Ben was compiling comparative analysis between ancient Akkadian verb patterns and early AI mistranslations, he received an unexpected visitor, Richard Coleman himself, this time without a meeting request, without his usual entourage. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything sacred," Richard said, stepping into the room. Ben looked up from the screen and gestured to the opposite chair. "Just reconstructing grammar structures lost for over 2 millennia. Nothing urgent." Richard laughed. A real one, not the polished, performative one Ben had heard in meetings past. "You're settling in." "I am," Ben said, "though I'm still adjusting to being asked for my opinion, rather than being asked to leave a room before meetings start." Richard nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. "That's actually what I came to talk about. You probably noticed by now that you're making waves." "I've noticed," Ben said, "though waves are not always welcome in calm waters." Richard sat down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You become a symbol, whether you meant to or not. People see you and realize they've overlooked more than just a person. They've overlooked possibility. And that makes some of them uncomfortable." "I'm not trying to make a point," Ben said. I'm just trying to do what I'm good at. I know, Richard replied. And that's what makes a point louder. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of machines in the background. Then Richard leaned back and smiled. You remember what I said in that meeting? About giving my salary to whoever could translate that text? Ben nodded, eyes steady. Well, Richard continued, I've had a few people remind me of that comment recently, mostly as a joke. Some were serious. HR even asked if we should clarify it was said in jest. And should you? Ben asked. Richard chuckled. I mean, legally, sure, but ethically, that's more complicated. Ben didn't say anything. Richard studied him. So what if I did it? What if I actually signed over 1/4 of my salary, just once, and gave it to you? Ben looked directly at him. Then you would be trying to make a spectacle of something that was never about money. Richard sat back, blinking. Fair enough. I don't want your salary, Ben continued. What I want, what I need, is not financial validation. It's structural change. You saw me because I spoke up in a room where I wasn't expected to. But there are others like me here. People you've never asked to speak. People whose resumes don't fit your filters. Richard nodded slowly. You think I've been blind. I think you've been busy, Ben said. And like most people in your position, you trust systems more than stories. Systems are efficient, but stories are human. And this place, your company, is full of stories no one's listening to. Richard was quiet. The weight of the words settled. Then help me fix it, he said at last. Not just by consulting on language models. Help me design a program, an internal pathway for underutilized talent. People who came through the side door like you did. Ben raised an eyebrow. You want me to become a recruiter? I want you to become something this place has never had, a guide for people who were never supposed to make it to the table. Ben considered that. And what would this role be called? Richard shrugged. Up to you. Title it however you want. Just make it real. Ben sat back, processing. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't even considered it. But now that it was on the table, it felt less like a promotion and more like a responsibility. I'll think about it, he said. But on one condition. Name it. I want to keep doing the language work. I didn't come here to be turned into a symbol. I came to recover something I lost. I'm not done yet. Richard smiled. Fair. Keep your desk. Keep your manuscripts. Build whatever you want around that. Ben nodded as Richard stood to leave. He turned back one more time. Just so you know, even if you'd taken my salary, it wouldn't have come close to what you gave this place in return. Ben smiled, faint but honest. Then maybe start seeing people differently. Richard froze, recognizing the echo of the very line Ben had spoken that day in the conference room, the line that had shifted the dynamic entirely. And now, here it was again, not as a quip, not as a punchline, but as a reminder. As the door closed behind him, Ben turned back to his screen. The Akkadian script still waited unsolved. The prayer fragments needed cross-referencing. The proto-symbols required mapping. But more than that, a new document needed drafting, one that outlined a program for hidden voices, forgotten skills, and unseen talents. That night, as he returned home, he told Amal about the conversation. You said no to the salary? She asked, surprised but not entirely. I said no to being paid for something that wasn't about money. And now he wants you to build something? Ben nodded. Something real. She placed her hand on his. Then build it. Just make sure it's not just for people like you, but for people who haven't even had their moment yet. I will, he said. He opened his laptop that evening and began writing, not translations, not linguistic reports, but a proposal, a new kind of document, one that began not with a mission statement, but with a question. What might we discover if we listened before we filtered? It started, as many things do in the modern office world, with an email, not from Ben and not from Richard, but from an intern named Elise who worked in the company's internal communications department. She had been in the building during the now legendary translation incident and had overheard fragments of follow-up conversations. Driven by curiosity, she had started asking questions. One thing led to another. By the end of the week, she had pieced together enough details to write a short internal newsletter segment for the company's monthly bulletin. She titled it, "The Story You Miss While Grabbing Coffee." The article ran 3 paragraphs long and appeared near the bottom of the email that circulated every Friday. In any other week, it would have been overlooked, but this one caught attention. Within 2 hours of going out, it had been forwarded over 60 times, internally and externally. Screenshots appeared on Slack channels and message threads, and even in a LinkedIn post that simply read, "Sometimes the most brilliant person in the building is the one you never bother to ask." By Monday morning, the article had been reshared so many times that the internal communications team received a directive from HR to prepare a follow-up. The response wasn't negative. In fact, the buzz was overwhelmingly positive. Admiration, surprise, reflection. But what had started as a quiet anecdote had now become a point of cultural conversation. Ben only became aware of the article after 2 employees from a different department stopped by his workspace. "You're a professor, right?" One of them asked, hesitant. "I was a professor," Ben said. "Now I'm whatever this is." The other smiled. "You're kind of famous around here." Ben blinked. "I don't even have a nameplate." "You don't need one. You're the guy who rewrote the definition of overlooked." Word spread fast, but not just within the building. One of the company's HR directors, impressed by the unexpected reaction to the article, pitched the story to a major tech podcast focused on workplace diversity and unconventional talent pipelines. The podcast host, intrigued by the blend of humility, brilliance, and corporate blind spots, asked for an interview. Ben declined at first. He wasn't interested in being turned into a symbol, let alone a narrative for someone else's platform. But after a long conversation with Amal that evening, during which she reminded him that silence could also be complicity, he reconsidered. So, 2 weeks later, he sat across from a microphone in a quiet room, headphones over his ears, answering questions from a calm-voiced host who navigated the line between curiosity and respect. "What made you speak up that day?" the host asked. "I didn't plan to," Ben replied. "I was just tired of staying quiet when I knew the answer. And before that moment, did anyone here know what you used to do?" "No," he said simply. "But that wasn't their fault. I never told them. I assumed they wouldn't care." "Why?" "Because for a long time, I believed that if my past didn't fit the present mold, it had no value here." The interview lasted 30 minutes. It wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was honest, and that was what made it powerful. By the end of the day, the episode had already reached thousands of listeners. The company's Slack channels lit up with discussions. Some employees expressed embarrassment. Others share their own stories of being overlooked or underutilized. A few managers privately reached out to Ben, asking him for help creating better channels for discovering hidden internal talent. Then came the message from HR. They wanted to feature Ben in a company-wide video campaign titled Beyond the Resume. It would highlight stories of individuals who came from unconventional paths, yet brought extraordinary value. Ben was hesitant again, but Richard himself reached out. "This isn't just about you," Richard said over the phone. "It's about what you represent, and it's not performative. I'm not looking for a poster child. I want a culture shift." Ben paused. "Will you follow through once the spotlight fades?" There was a long silence on the line before Richard replied, "I will. Hold me to it." Ben agreed to participate. The filming took place over 2 days. They shot him in his workspace, quietly reviewing ancient manuscripts and transcriptions. They captured footage of him walking the same halls he had once cleaned, nodding to the janitorial staff who still remembered him as one of their own. They even asked him to speak directly to the camera. He thought for a moment before saying, "I used to think silence was safety, but silence also hides potential. Sometimes, the most important thing you can do is speak, especially when no one expects you to." The video went live during the next all-hands company meeting. It wasn't flashy, no dramatic music, just Ben's story, plainly told, set against the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to contribute. The response was overwhelming. Internal chat rooms flooded with messages of appreciation. Employees began sharing their own stories of overlooked backgrounds, unspoken skills, and the quiet resilience they had carried through years of feeling invisible. Departments began hosting informal talent discovery sessions. One team in marketing even created an initiative to profile hidden experts across the company. Ben, meanwhile, continued his work, translating, interpreting, mentoring. But now, people came to him not just for answers, but for perspective. Junior engineers asked for reading lists on ancient texts. AI developers invited him to brainstorming sessions. Even senior staff stopped by to ask how they could better structure hiring to include those from non-traditional backgrounds. Still, he remained grounded. He continued to have lunch with the janitorial staff once a week. He helped one of them, a recent immigrant from Eritrea, refine his English resume. He volunteered to review applications for a new internship program for refugees the company had decided to pilot. And one quiet afternoon, as he was preparing notes for a model training session on symbolic language pattern recognition, he received an envelope. No return address, just his name written in cursive. Inside was a handwritten note. You reminded us that value isn't loud. Thank you for giving silence its voice. There was no signature. He smiled, folded the note, and placed it between the pages of an old Syriac manuscript he kept near his desk. News had traveled fast, but what lingered longer was something quieter than headlines or clicks. It was awareness. It was change. And most of all, it was a sound of voices, once silent, finally beginning to be heard. It was on a Thursday afternoon, when most of the company was distracted with end-of-week reports in preparation for a looming product demo, that Ben received the invitation. Not an email, not a message. A formal envelope, delivered by hand, sealed in dark blue wax and marked with the executive floor's emblem. He recognized the symbol. It adorned Richard Coleman's private office documents. Inside was a note handwritten, "Ben, join me tomorrow morning. I have something I'd like you to consider." R. No explanation. No agenda. No mention of departments or duties. Just a request for presence. The meeting was set for 8 o'clock, before most employees would arrive, before the day had a chance to scatter attention in a dozen directions. Ben spent the evening preparing, not for a pitch or negotiation, but for the simple possibility that something once again might shift. He had learned not to make assumptions. The past few weeks had been generous, yes, but they had also been unpredictable. Recognition, while validating, brought expectations, and he knew too well how easily opportunities could mutate into burdens if not carefully navigated. When he arrived the next morning, the building was unusually quiet. Rain tapped gently against the glass facade, and the city beyond was still half asleep. A security guard nodded at him as he passed, now recognizing him not as a cleaner, but as a staff member with an active internal profile. He took the elevator up, alone, watching the numbers blink with slow intent. Richard's assistant was already at her desk, typing. She looked up and gave him a warm, knowing smile. "He's expecting you." Ben nodded and entered the office. Richard stood by the window, holding a mug of black coffee, his posture casual but alert. He didn't turn immediately, giving Ben a few seconds to take in view. Seattle draped in silver light, the bay just beginning to catch the morning glow. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Richard said. "I still remember when this view was just a dream, a picture taped above a second-hand desk in my garage." Ben stepped further inside. Dreams tend to change once they become real. Richard turned and gestured toward the 2 chairs by the small meeting table near the bookshelves. "Let's sit. This won't take long." They settled in, the quiet stretching between them comfortably. "I've been thinking about something," Richard began. "Something that's been hard to put into words." Ben waited. "When we first met, really met, you were holding a mop. I was holding a challenge I thought no one in the building could solve. You know how rare it is for a man in my position to be proven wrong in public. I imagine it doesn't happen often." "It doesn't," Richard said, smiling faintly. "But I'm glad it did." He leaned forward slightly. "You've done more in a month than some of our department heads have managed in a year. You've brought clarity to projects that were spinning in circles. And somehow, you've managed to do it without ego, without disruption. just precision. Ben inclined his head, accepting the compliment without indulging it. Richard continued, his tone shifting. The thing is, your role, this consultant position, it's temporary. That was the agreement. But I think we both know you're not temporary. You're not transitional. You're essential. Ben's gaze sharpened slightly. He wasn't surprised, but he didn't speak. I want to offer you a permanent position, Richard said. Not as a consultant. Not even just as a linguist. I want you to lead a division. Something new. Something that didn't exist before you got here. Ben raised an eyebrow. A division? Yes. I'm calling it cross-cultural intelligence. It's an experimental team. A fusion of linguistic anthropology, symbolic logic, historical context analysis, and natural language processing. Your work has made it clear. We're training AI to interpret language, but without understanding the soul behind it, we're only getting half the picture. And you want me to build that understanding? I want you to lead the effort. Build the team. Define the scope. Hire people who don't fit the mold. Scholars, translators, philosophers, coders who studied Sanskrit in monasteries or read hieroglyphs for fun. People like you, hidden until they're not. Ben took a breath. The weight of it settled. What you're asking is, he trailed off, searching for the right phrase. Unprecedented, Richard offered. Yes, but not impossible. There was a pause, long and thoughtful. And the terms? Ben asked. Full-time. Senior-level compensation. You report directly to me. You set your own hiring criteria. The only expectation is results, and I trust you define what that means for the first year. Ben leaned back. The room felt both smaller and larger at the same time. This wasn't just an offer. It was an invitation to redraw boundaries between departments, between disciplines, between the visible and the invisible within an organization that was finally learning to look deeper. He looked at Richard. Why me? Richard didn't flinch. Because you didn't ask for this. And because you didn't make it about you when everyone else would have. You showed us what we were missing, and not just in language, but in the way we listen. Ben was silent. Then he said, I'll need time to consider it. Of course, Richard replied, but not too much time. This isn't just a job offer. It's the beginning of something none of us can quite define yet. Ben nodded. I understand. They stood. This time, the handshake between them wasn't a formality. It was a contract in spirit, even if unsigned. As Ben left the office, the rain had stopped. The city outside was waking up in full. Taxis moved along wet streets. A child in a yellow jacket jumped over a puddle. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry sounded its horn across the bay. Back at his desk, Ben opened a new document. The title bar blinked with promise. He typed 2 words. Origin map. It would be the foundation of the division Richard had envisioned. An interwoven system mapping the development of human meaning across cultures, languages, and time. Not just a technical project. A legacy. And this time, he wouldn't be standing outside the glass. He would be drawing the map from the center. Ben didn't give an answer the next day, or the one after that. Richard, to his credit, respected the silence. He didn't press, didn't send follow-up emails, or drop subtle reminders. He knew that the decision before Ben wasn't one of ambition or ego. It wasn't about title or salary. It was, for Ben, a matter of identity. The offer, leading a new division, building a framework of cultural intelligence from scratch, answering not to middle managers but directly to the CEO, was unprecedented. But so was everything about Ben's story. And the more he sat with the offer, the more conflicted he became. He found himself standing at a crossroads that didn't exist on any map. On one side was safety, a life carved from patience and routine, the familiarity of limits, the quiet dignity of work done well, even if unseen. On the other side was risk, not just the weight of leadership, but the threat of exposure. Accepting the role meant placing himself in a position where failure would be visible, where judgment would be swift, where the story that had elevated him could just as easily turn into a cautionary tale. At home, he said little about the offer at first. I'm all sensed anyway. They were sitting on the floor of their living room, sorting through old folders to help Layla with a school project. Among the files was a thin, worn envelope with a university crest embossed on the corner. Ben's acceptance letter to the PhD program he had completed more than 20 years ago. Amal picked it up. "Do you remember how proud your father was when this arrived?" Ben smiled faintly. "He told every neighbor on our street before I even read it. He told them you'd change the world," she said. "I changed rooms," Ben said, only half joking. "From one classroom to another, and then eventually to this country. But now you have a chance to change something again," she replied, softer. "Not for pride, not for stories, for real people." Ben nodded slowly. "I don't want to fail, not in front of everyone." "You didn't fail when no one saw you. Why would you fail now when people finally want to listen?" He didn't answer. He knew she was right. But fear, once lived in for too long, becomes familiar, and stepping away from it can feel like betrayal. The next morning, after walking Layla to school, he stopped at a small cafe near their apartment. He ordered tea and sat by the window, watching the city move. It was raining again, Seattle's constant him. He opened a notebook, not the company-issued kind, but the leather-bound one he had brought with him from Damascus. Most of the pages were still blank. He had only ever written in it during moments of deep thought, as if it were too sacred for trivial things. He turned to a fresh page and began to list questions. Why am I hesitating? What am I afraid of? What happens if I say no? What happens if I say yes? Who else might follow if I walk first? The last question lingered. That afternoon, he returned to his desk at the company. On his monitor, he had been building a prototype for a digital framework he called the Origin Map, a dynamic interface that visually linked language fragments to cultural moments, philosophical shifts, and historical migration. It was still in its infancy, mostly code and theory. But it worked. In a quiet way, it already proved that his role wasn't a symbolic one. It was functional, necessary. Midway through his work session, he was interrupted by a knock. It was Tomas, carrying a small plastic container and a sheepish grin. "Hey," Tomas said, "I brought you something." Ben looked up. "It's nothing fancy, just baklava from that little place on Fifth. I figured, I don't know, maybe you like something sweet while solving the universe." Ben smiled. "Thank you. That's kind." Tomas sat down awkwardly. "I heard about the offer. From Priya." Ben's smile faded. "Of course you did." "No one's gossiping," Tomas said quickly. "It's more like we're hoping you'll say yes." Ben raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because when you walked into that meeting and translated what none of us could, you didn't just show us something brilliant. You showed us that intelligence doesn't always wear the right badge or sit in the right seat. You saying yes, it tells the rest of us that maybe someday we could say yes to something bigger than we thought we deserved." Ben stared at him, quiet. Tomas stood. "Sorry, didn't mean to put pressure. Just think about it." Ben nodded. "I am." That night, he spoke with Amal again. "If I take this," he said, "everything changes." "Not everything," she replied. "You'll still be my husband. You'll still walk Layla to school. You'll still read ancient languages for fun. The only thing that changes is who gets to see the real you. And if I fail, then you'll fail trying to make something better. And I'll still be proud of you." He held her hand and felt something in him finally settle. Not the anxiety, but the purpose underneath it. He returned to work the next morning and asked for a meeting with Richard. They sat again in that quiet office, the city glimmering outside the window. "I've made my decision," Ben said. Richard folded his hands. "And I'll accept the offer on 2 conditions." "Go on." "First, I want full autonomy over my hiring process. I won't run resumes through algorithms. I'll talk to people, listen to their stories. I want to build a team that no other department would think to build." "Agreed," Richard said. "Second," Ben continued, "this division can't be internal only. I want to create partnerships with universities, immigrant communities, underrepresented scholars. If this work stays inside these walls, it loses its meaning." Richard hesitated, then nodded slowly. "We'll find a way. I'll back you." Ben extended his hand. This time, it wasn't just a handshake. It was a beginning. And this time, there would be no silence to break. The following Monday morning, the lobby at Coleman Technologies buzzed with its usual pace. Coffee cups in hand, hurried voices, elevator chimes, and the clipped rhythm of shoes on polished floors. But one figure moved through it all with a presence that broke the pattern. Ben Ayed entered at 7:45 in the morning. No mop, no cart, no uniform. He wore a clean dark blue blazer over a crisp shirt, slacks pressed without a wrinkle, and a modest brown leather satchel slung across his shoulder. The ID badge clipped to his belt no longer had a janitorial code. It now read, Ben Ayed, Director, Cross-Cultural Intelligence. He did not rush. He walked with quiet purpose, not out of defiance or mega statement, but because this was how he had always walked, unhurried, observant, composed. It was only now that people truly noticed. A woman near the elevator slowed her steps and glanced back. A man from marketing stopped mid-conversation to give a small, respectful nod. The receptionist, who had once greeted him only with procedural politeness, now stood up as he passed and offered a warm, "Good morning, Mr. Ayed." Ben returned the greeting with a soft smile and continued toward the executive wing, where his new office was being prepared. But before he reached the glass corridor that led to his destination, he paused. Down one floor, just off a service hallway, was the janitorial break room, a place few outside the cleaning staff ever entered. It was modest. Vending machine, old coffee pot, cracked plastic chairs. But for 3 years, it had been where he changed his shoes, hung his coat, ate in silence, and rested between rounds of invisible work. He took the stairs instead of the elevator. When he entered, 2 familiar faces looked up. Miguel, a soft-spoken man from Oaxaca, who had been with the company even longer than Ben, and Adama, a Ghanaian woman who always hummed gospel melodies while wiping down conference tables. They stared at him for a moment before recognition lit their eyes. "Ben," Miguel said, standing. Adama smiled wide. "Look at you." Ben stepped forward, extending a hand to Miguel, who shook it and then pulled him into a quiet hug. Adama did the same, her voice full of affection. "We heard," she said. "People been talking." "Good things, I hope," Ben replied with a smile. "Respectful things," Miguel said. "That's better than good." Ben nodded. "I wanted to come here first, before I go up there." "You don't have to explain," Adama said, waving a hand. "We're proud of you." Ben sat for a moment, his hands resting on his knees. "It doesn't feel like a goodbye, but I also know things will be different." "They should be," Miguel said. "Different isn't bad." "I'll still stop by," Ben said, "and I'll never forget what it felt like to start the day in this room." Adama reached for a paper cup and poured him coffee. "Then don't forget, just don't come back trying to fix our schedules or tell us how to scrub corners." They all laughed. After a few more minutes, he stood and said his goodbyes, not with fanfare, but with warmth, the kind that only comes from those who share quiet hours together long before the spotlight found him. Back upstairs, his new office was nearly ready. The walls were bare for now, save for a whiteboard and a bookshelf waiting to be filled. A large window offered a view of the skyline, but Ben found himself more interested in the view behind him, the hallway outside, where people passed in both directions, each carrying their own story. He sat at the desk and opened his laptop. Waiting in his inbox were 3 resumes, early applicants for the new division. One was from a former museum curator who had left academia during a family emergency. Another was from a graduate student who spoke 5 languages but had been rejected from traditional language firms for lack of industry experience. The third came from a poet-turned-coder who had developed a passion for dead languages after decoding family manuscripts left behind in a war-torn village. Ben reviewed each with care. These were not the resumes HR would flag. These were the ones that lived in the margins, just like he had. A knock on his office door broke his focus. It was Priya Desai, smiling as she leaned in. "Just wanted to say congratulations again. I saw the badge this morning. Looks good on you. Still getting used to it," Ben said. "I wanted to let you know something. One of the interns who watched your video, Elise, just enrolled in a linguistics program. Said she didn't know the field existed until you spoke. Ben blinked. I didn't think anyone watched that video more than once. They did, Priya said. Some of us more than once. She left with a nod, and Ben turned back to his screen. A message had just come through from Richard. It was short. Let me know when you're ready to present the origin map. No rush. Just excited to see how it grows. Ben leaned back. The origin map, the digital framework he had designed, was still a prototype, but it was becoming something far more dynamic than he'd imagined. It didn't just track linguistic evolution. It told stories. It showed how words travel across centuries, how prayers changed shapes, how cultures buried meaning in symbols only to have it rediscovered by others. It was a living archive of human complexity. He glanced around the room. Later that afternoon, a delivery arrived. A single-frame print sent anonymously. It was a minimalist line drawing of an open door with light pouring through. No inscription, no sender, just the image, quiet and powerful. He hung it above his desk. That day, when he left the office, he took the long route, through departments he hadn't visited before, past faces that now greeted him not out of surprise but out of acknowledgement. When he passed a conference room, he saw someone pointing at a page filled with strange symbols. Does anyone know what this says? A voice asked. Ben paused at the threshold. I can translate that, he said, stepping forward, not with hesitation this time, but with assurance. They welcomed him in. 3 months later, the air inside Coleman Technologies had subtly changed, not in its architecture or its protocols, but in its atmosphere, the culture, the conversations, the kinds of questions people were beginning to ask. The phrase, "What do we miss when we only look at resumes?" had become an unofficial motto in several departments. And perhaps more notably, the newly formed Cross-Cultural Intelligence Division had become more than just an experiment. It was now a model. Ben Ayed sat at the front of the auditorium, adjusting his tie for the 4th time in 10 minutes. The fabric felt too stiff, the not too formal. But Amal had insisted. It was a significant day, and while he had never cared much for appearances, she reminded him that sometimes dressing with intention was part of speaking with purpose. Today, he was not translating manuscripts. He was the keynote speaker at the company's annual Diversity and Inclusion Summit, an event that had, until this year, been largely symbolic. Panels, talking points, pre-approved statements. But something about the year's events had shifted the tone, and leadership had asked for something different, something real. The room filled slowly, first with early arriving employees, then with clusters from various teams, and finally with the senior executives, including Richard, who sat in the front row, arms crossed, a faint but expectant smile on his face. Priya was there too, along with several members of Ben's own team, people he had personally recruited, many of whom had never worked in corporate environments before, but were now contributing to projects that shaped product decisions and public-facing AI systems. When it was time, Ben stood. He walked to the podium without notes, not because he didn't need them, but because what he had to say had lived inside him long before the stage existed. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady, carrying just enough weight to fill the space without pressing down on it. "Some of you know who I am. Some of you know only the story. A cleaner, a translation, a promotion. That version has been told many ways, some accurate, some romanticized. But I'm not here today to talk about how I got here. I want to talk about something else." He paused, allowing the silence to draw people closer. "When I first came to this building, no one asked me where I had come from. No one asked what I knew. No one asked what I had lost. And I didn't tell them, because I believed that silence was safer than explaining a life no one had made room for." A few heads nodded in the crowd. But what I've learned is that silence is not safety. Silence is erasure. Silence is the slow fading of identity beneath the noise of efficiency, structure, and assumptions. And the longer we accept silence as normal, the more brilliance we bury beneath it. He stepped away from the podium, choosing to speak directly, without the barrier. "I've met people in this company, people in this room, who have degrees you'll never see on a LinkedIn profile, who've taught in refugee camps, who've interpreted sacred text by candlelight, who've survived wars, raised siblings, crossed oceans. And none of that shows up in a keyword search." He looked to the corner where one of his newest hires sat, a woman who had once been a classical scholar in northern Iraq before being displaced. Now, she was training an AI model to understand semantic nuance in dialect clusters no one else in the building could even identify. We keep telling ourselves that merit will rise, that systems are neutral, that if someone's good enough, they'll be found. But what I've seen is that merit only rises when we bother to look beneath the surface. Systems are only neutral when built by people who choose not to question their own assumptions. He let the words settle unhurried. This is not just about hiring. It's about listening. It's about recognizing that some people speak quietly not because they lack knowledge, but because they've learned that shouting rarely brings understanding. And when they finally do speak, when they offer what they know, it's not our job to be surprised. It's our job to make space. Ben returned to the podium. He placed both hands on it, grounding himself. I've been called a symbol, but I'm not interested in being a symbol. Symbols are static. They hang on walls. I am interested in movement, in building, in making sure that the next person who walks into this building with a history no one can see doesn't have to wait 3 years to be asked a single question. He leaned in slightly. I'll end with a line. It's not from a manual or a strategy deck. It's from a language I once taught, the one that brought me into your conference room months ago. He spoke the words in Aramaic first, letting the ancient syllables fill the space. Then he translated. Never assume silence means ignorance. Sometimes it's just someone waiting for the right moment to be heard. There was no applause at first, just stillness, and then a quiet rise, clapping that built steadily until it filled the room. Richard stood. So did Priya. So did others, engineers, assistants, executives, people who had never spoken to each other before that morning. Ben didn't bask in it. He simply nodded once and stepped away from the microphone. Later, in the hallway outside the auditorium, people approached him, not with praise, but with questions. Real ones, about policy, hiring, curriculum, mentorship. One junior developer asked if he could shadow Ben's team for a week. Another wanted to volunteer to tutor English to recent refugee hires. A project lead from marketing asked if Ben could help review the cultural assumptions embedded in their advertising copy. Change had not come through declarations. It had come through a shift in posture. Back in his office, Ben removed the framed line drawing from above his desk, the open door with the light pouring through. He placed it in a box marked for a new location. His team was moving into a larger suite, closer to the AI division. Growth demanded space. And now, for the first time, space was being made. As he walked through the building that afternoon, passing people from every level of the company, he noticed something quiet but remarkable. People were looking at each other more intentionally, not with suspicion, with curiosity, with the courage to wonder, what else have I not seen? Ben smiled to himself. He had not changed the world, but he had changed a room. And sometimes that's how the world begins to change.